founded with the belief that citizens of Pennsylvania need nonpartisan, data-driven information to build a better future for our Commonwealth and our communities. We provide stakeholders with independent information and insight on public policy issues impacting our communities. We also provide technical assistance to state and local government, independent research on state and local issues impacting our communities, and civic education, such as this Issues Forum, weekly email alerts, expert testimony, and more that give insight on emerging policy issues. I want to take a moment to thank Phil Klotz. He's our Director of Government and Community Affairs for his work to pull together today's Issues Forum. Thank you, Phil, for everything you do for the Economy League. A few logistics and housekeeping notes before we get started. We have 4 presenters today, from researchers to practitioners, to provide a national, state, and local perspective on workforce trends and workforce post-COVID. We'll have time at the end for discussion and Q&A. Please submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the time we have. Finally, we're recording this and we'll post it at pelcentral.org for future viewing or for those who couldn't attend today. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Rakesh Kochar, Senior Researcher at Pew Research Center. He will provide a foundation for us this morning on the COVID-19 impact on the U.S. workforce. Rakesh is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center and an expert on trends on employment, income, and wealth. His research has focused on the American and global middle classes and the economic well-being of white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and immigrant workers. Prior to joining Pew, he was a senior economist at Joel Popkin & Company, where he served as a consultant to government agencies, private firms, international agencies, and labor unions. He received his doctorate in economics from Brown University. Rakesh, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, LeeAnne. Let me start sharing the screen and we can get started. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Can everyone? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Thanks. Good morning. It is my pleasure to start the day with you all. For starters, I would like to thank also Phil, LeeAnne, and the League for inviting me to be a part of the panel today. My name is Rakesh Kochar, and I'm with the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. We conduct social science research and public opinion research without regard to partisanship or advocacy. As such, we offer no policy recommendations. At the center, my focus is on economic issues covering labor market developments, both in the US and globally. Like many others, I've been keeping an eye on the economic impact of the pandemic for the past year or so. I was asked today to speak about the effect of the pandemic on the employment of different groups of workers from a national perspective. And that is exactly what you're going to get. But if need be, we can cover related ground in the Q&A. So without further ado, I will begin with a bird's eye view of employment during the pandemic. The bottom line is we still have a ways to go. So far in 2021, at the top, you'll see that employment in the US has averaged about close to 152 million workers. That is about 6 million less than what employment used to be back in 2019. Now, to be sure, there has been some progress since 2020 when employment had dipped to close to 148 million. So the flip side of this is the increase in unemployment shown at the bottom of the screen, from about 6 million in 2019 to about 9 million this year. This too is an improvement over 2020 when unemployment averaged close to 13 million for the year. Now you would have noticed that while employment is down 6 million, unemployment is up only 3 million. So the reason is that many workers appear to be disengaged from the labor force at the moment. If you look at the US labor force, the workers who are neither working nor looking for work are people out of the labor force. The rest of us employed or looking for work are in the labor force. About 2.5 million have left the labor force since 2019. Additionally, at the bottom half of the screen, there are about 1.3 million people who are not at work for some unspecified reason. So altogether, about 3 million people. That's the number, the difference between the decrease in employment and the increase in unemployment. So about 3 million people are disengaged, or what other people say are missing from the labor force. As they return to the workforce, as they come back looking for work, chances are unemployment may increase again. Now we know that the official rate of unemployment, the green line in this chart, that itself spiked greatly during the pandemic. Starting at just 3.8% in February 2020, the official unemployment rate peaked at 14.4% in April. That is the highest rate recorded in the post-World War II era, higher than the peak in the Great Recession. But then it has fallen steadily thereafter, and a year later, in February 21, stood at 6.6%. Currently, it's down to 4.8%. But as I just noted, the official rate may not be telling the whole story. This is compounded by data collection challenges that arose during the pandemic. So if we make some adjustments for the so-called disengaged or missing workers and other measurement issues during the pandemic, chances are the unemployment rate during the pandemic may have been as high as 22.7%. That is sort of an upper bound. But that upper bound puts us in the Great Depression territory, not just the Great Recession territory. But this too has fallen rapidly, and that's the key difference between now and the Great Depression is the duration of the recession. The current recession, in fact, is the shortest in US history, just 2 months long. So what are the main drivers of unemployment during the pandemic? Now, there were two major factors. One, the risk of unemployment depended on whether you worked in an industry where social distancing was hard. And the other factor was whether your job could potentially be teleworked. Now, overall, in the initial phase of the pandemic, about 16 million jobs were lost from the US economy. About a third of this loss came from one sector alone, leisure and hospitality, a sector that accounted for about 10% of employment overall. And this is the sector you are well familiar with. Restaurants, hotels, and similar businesses all hit hard by the pandemic because of social distancing requirements. Three other sectors, health and social services, professional and business services, and retail trade accounted for another third of losses during the pandemic, which was about equal to their share in US employment. Now, who was exposed to these high-risk sectors? As it turns out, women had much greater exposure than men to the industries that shed the greatest share of jobs. 54% of women worked in those four industries I just highlighted, compared with 38% of men. So it is for this reason that many have called the COVID recession the she-cession, for its initial larger effect on women. Normally, we see recessions centered in manufacturing, construction, and other goods sectors. On the other hand, there was little difference by race and ethnicity. I've just highlighted Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. There was no difference in exposure to these four industries. Now, social distancing also meant that not having the option to telework was a major risk factor when it came to holding on to your job. Again, when the pandemic first hit, at the very first wave of job losses, 90% was centered in occupations that could not be teleworked. So whether or not you could telework made a big difference. And in a bit of a counter to the she-cession narrative, we see that women were actually more likely than men to work in jobs that could be teleworked, 41% of women versus 31% of men. And looking across racial and ethnic groups, Hispanics and Black workers were more exposed or to this risk not being able to telework compared with Asian or white workers. Asian workers who tend to be concentrated in STEM occupations more so than other workers were most likely to be able to telework. Likewise, education plays a role. Those of us with a bachelor's degree or higher level of education, 6 out of 10 could telework, whereas other workers had far more exposure to this particular risk. So overall, the interplay of these two factors, along with their interaction with demographics, combined to determine how unemployment played out among various groups. As it turns out, over the long haul, in this case, a year and a half now, the broad trends have played out similarly across women and men and across different racial and ethnic groups. So looking first at women versus men during the pandemic, at the very peak of the pandemic, we can see that women did experience a higher rate of unemployment, 14% versus about 12% for men. They started out on near similar footing. The women's unemployment rate back in 2019 was running a tad lower than that for men, but women peaked at a higher rate. So we are back to the she-session narrative initially, but now we are back to where things were. There's no difference between the rate of unemployment between men and women, although for both it remains higher than it was before the pandemic. And a similar narrative plays out when we look at racial and ethnic groups. Historically, in the United States, Black and Hispanic workers have had higher unemployment rates than white and Asian workers. So Black workers, for example, initially their unemployment rate stood around 7%. It peaked around 17%, which was the same peak experienced by Hispanic workers. And now the rate for Black workers is down to 8.5%, about half what it was during the pandemic, but higher than it was before the pandemic. And the same narrative plays out for Hispanic workers. Their unemployment rate is down to 6.2, about a percentage point higher than it was before the pandemic, but below the rate for Black workers. So that narrative has played out for all racial and ethnic groups. What is most notable here was what happened to Asian workers. They historically have a pretty low unemployment rate because they are, on average, the most highly educated of workers among racial ethnic groups. But their unemployment rate went from 3% to 14%, a quintupling, which was the highest proportional increase in the unemployment rate during the pandemic. But their employment situation has also improved a lot, and unemployment is now down to 4.7%. Now, the COVID recession did lean into inequality. Low-wage workers have experienced the greatest loss during the pandemic. In the first year of the pandemic, their employment fell by close to 12%. Compared with a loss of 5% for middle wage workers and a loss of 1% for high wage workers. This actually was one difference between the pandemic and the Great Recession. During the Great Recession, which was centered around construction and manufacturing jobs, most job losses came from middle wage workers, or rather middle wage workers experienced the greatest loss in jobs. And I will close quickly with a note from what we've heard from the public itself. This is from a survey conducted in January 21. So we're looking about 1 year's worth of the pandemic. And we asked people about their experiences during the course of that year. Overall, 33% of adults told us they had been laid off or lost a job. Another 31% said they had to take a cut in pay. And you combine the two, overall, 44%, close to half of all adults in the US experienced some combination of a loss in job or a cut in pay. And this experience was most acute among Hispanic and Asian adults, where more than half of them tell us that they experienced either of these two events. Thank you. I will conclude with that and leave the rest to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. Our next speaker is Dr. Greg Wright from the Brookings Institution Fellow and University of California Associate Professor of Economics. Greg will speak about promoting economic mobility in Pennsylvania. He is a fellow at Brookings in the Global Economy and Development Program, where he co-leads the Workforce of the Future initiative. His academic work has appeared in top economics journals and is focused on the labor market impacts of globalization, immigration, and technological change. Recent papers have estimated the impact of offshoring and immigration on US jobs, the impact of investments in information and communications technologies on wage inequality, and the historical impact of globalization on labor markets. Greg has a BA in astrophysics from UC Berkeley and an MA and PhD in economics from UC Davis. Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, so I'm gonna just briefly talk about the Pennsylvania economy, and Rakesh did a great job of summarizing sort of the current state of things. So I won't dwell too much on that, but yeah, so I lead the Workforce of the Future initiative at Brookings. And so that could mean a lot of things, but the Workforce of the Future initiative, so we're focused mainly on questions of economic mobility and you know, how people find their way into good career pathways and where people get stuck in the labor market. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but let me just start off. Yeah, so this is, I'm not going to dwell here because this is primarily what Rakesh was talking about, which was where are we right now? So where is Pennsylvania? And I think this is just highlighting the leisure and hospitality industry. But if you looked at retail or other related industries, you'd see something very similar, which is COVID, you know, obviously hit these sectors hard, and then we're somewhere, you know, near to where we were you know, a couple of years ago, though not quite yet. Okay. The other thing I just wanted to highlight here, because so actually, you know, the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually just a week ago started publishing these state level estimates of job openings, meaning sort of job postings, basically, and hires and quits. And so they have a bunch of this information that was typically at the national level, but now they do it at the state level, which is nice. So we can see for Pennsylvania, it looks a lot like the rest of the country, which means mainly that job postings are way up over the last few months. So this is kind of this narrative that employers are having a hard time finding workers. And quits are way up as well. So that actually the bottom right graph is hires. So this is just kind of saying, look, on the top left, we have job openings are way up, but hiring is actually a little bit down, if anything. So there are all these, it's a very tight labor market, let's say. That's kind of the punchline. But now what I want to do is I just want to step back, and here I'm actually stepping quite a ways back. So these are plots that go back to 1963. And this is just plotting the change in US real weekly earnings. This is for the whole country, and then split by men and women. So this is just kind of setting me up for a few points here. And the first is just that something that I think probably most of us know, which is just that starting sort of in the mid and late 70s, we saw these sort of sustained declines in particularly men's real earnings, right? So you can see on the left-hand side, that's for men, and then it's decomposed by education level. So particularly if you're a high school dropout or even just a high school graduate, real weekly earnings are approximately now at the level that they were in like 1980, you know, the mid 80s, let's say, or around 1970 as well. So, so you have this real growth in wage inequality, and it's less the case for women, but it also is somewhat the case for women. So why, right? So we know the story of why for the most part, and the why is really, you know, Pennsylvania is very much kind of at the forefront of a lot of these trends because it historically had been a relatively manufacturing intensive state. And you can see this is just going back to 1998, I think. And just going back to 1998, you can see these steep declines in manufacturing employment. So, if we went back further, this trend, of course, is just continuing on back. So even, since the mid 90s, Pennsylvania has gone from about 1 million manufacturing workers to about 500,000 manufacturing workers. And you can see COVID there. It's the same story with the COVID recession here, which is that COVID caused a big decline and there's somewhat of a recovery, not quite back to where we were before COVID. But I will mention one other thing about this graph, which is that you can see that, and this is kind of an interesting fact that I think is important to keep in mind, which is that these declines in manufacturing are really a story about recessions. And what happens, right, is that firms are kind of going along business as usual, and then recessions come along and it offers firms opportunities to kind of a lot of these firms die and they lay off their workers. But what really happens is, probably more importantly, is that large firms use recessions as opportunities to reorganize their production processes, to shed workers, and then not to reemploy those workers in the future and find either new robotic ways of replacing those workers or new organizational ways of replacing them. But that leaves this question about what's going to happen with this COVID pandemic. It looks like manufacturing is recovering a little bit, but it's not necessarily the case that it's going to recover fully. Okay. So, this is all kind of leading up to a kind of punchline here, but I just wanted to put construction employment in here for Pennsylvania, just because it is kind of a type of industry that workers from manufacturing could potentially move into. Manufacturing is a very male-oriented sector, and so is construction, less so than it used to be, fortunately. But we have this question of where do these manufacturing workers go? And some of them will go to construction. And what I'm going to talk about in a minute here is that construction is actually is a very good sector actually for people to go into, because it does tend to pay okay, and it's upwardly mobile to some extent. We can see that construction employment has kind of basically remained steady. I mean, construction employment was rising prior to the pandemic. But what I want to say about this mainly is, look, this is for Pennsylvania. The red line is the housing price index for Pennsylvania, which, like the rest of the country, is going up. Housing prices are rising. And the blue line is the home ownership rate. So maybe, very unsurprisingly, as home prices rise, home ownership rates fall. And this is just an issue that is sort of a very national issue, right? Which is that we're not building enough homes. Right, the home prices are rising everywhere, particularly in urban areas, because we're not building enough homes, and that means home ownership rates fall too. But so you have manufacturing decline. You have these workers who have these particular skill sets that are primarily male. One thing that we could be doing is building more homes. Okay, so a lot of these workers could transition to the construction sector, and a lot of these workers could potentially transition to other sectors that are related to construction, like in transportation and logistics and things that actually are going to be receiving a lot of money very soon, probably, from the federal government. So I'll come back to that point in a minute, but okay. So I'm sorry for this picture, but I'm just going to, whoops. I want to make sure I don't go over time here. Okay. So this picture is a network model of the labor market. It looks worse than it is. Each dot is an occupation, and the size of the dot is how much employment is in that occupation. Bigger dots are bigger occupations, and how close the dots are to one another is how frequently workers transition between those occupations. Okay, so dots that are more close to one another are occupations that people are transitioning between a lot. So this is, we put these colors up here, which basically represent how, the wage level of the occupation. So you can just see that, workers kind of transition between low wage jobs, they kind of churn between low wage jobs, or they kind of move between high wage jobs, but they don't really as much crossover. So in other words, the dark dots are kind of separate from the light dots. And we can do other things with this type of network visualization, like just see which parts of the occupation space have these different features. For instance, occupations that are kind of over to the left of that network diagram tend to be male dominated, and the male dominated occupations also tend to be very routine oriented type of jobs like manufacturing, construction, things like that. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all of these different visualizations, but this network model of the labor market is kind of the core of what we do at the Workforce of the Future. And it offers all of these kind of insights about where people are in the labor market, where are people getting stuck in the labor market, how do people get out of different parts of the labor market. And that kind of brings me back to this issue of where do manufacturing workers go? And we have a little tool that can kind of show you, okay, well, where do manufacturing workers transition to when they leave manufacturing? And one place they transition to is construction or transportation or other things. So why am I bringing all of this up? Well, construction actually, like I said, is a very good industry for workers with little education. That's the key. So if you have little education, high school graduate or high school dropout, construction, so here's sectors of the economy arranged according to how well the jobs pay. And then the blue bar is a measure of how upwardly mobile the occupations are. So what is the chance that if you're in the construction industry that you're going to be able to transition into a higher wage job? And construction kind of falls nicely in the middle. Construction jobs are pretty well-paid jobs, and they're jobs that you can typically transition into better jobs from. Okay, so that's kind of the point here. Yeah, and then this is just kind of saying this more formally. We can say, well, where do they transition to? Okay, well, construction laborers tend to become often carpenters, and carpenters are a pretty well-paid job. So this is one sense in which construction is upwardly mobile. And you know what, construction is upwardly mobile because it allows people to move into trades, right? They become plumbers and electricians and carpenters, and they become construction managers and things like that. Okay, so I'm almost done here, and I'm just going to say that the other component of this is this massive amount of money that's coming down that I'm sure you're all thinking about. From the American Rescue Plan is already in progress, and then we potentially have infrastructure and a reconciliation bill coming through. So, but these are going to be opportunities to move people into these sectors that are not only well paid, but potentially upwardly mobile. And we try to always emphasize the upwardly mobile part because I think it's somewhat underappreciated. I mean, we want people to have high-paid jobs, well-paid jobs, but maybe even more importantly, we want people to get into jobs that are have career paths and offer them opportunity, et cetera. We have these tools that allow us to kind of look at how people transition across jobs, and we can do that by these tools allow us to do it by location. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but I just want to say that we have a tool called Mobility Pathways at the Workforce of the Future, and and this is for Pittsburgh. You can, we only have it at this point for metro areas, but you can look specifically at how workers are moving through the labor market in different locations. Final thing here. The final thing I want to say is just that we can also use this transition network, how people move through the labor market, to say things about inequities. And because there are a lot of pathways that are upwardly mobile, there are a lot of good job career paths out there, but some of these career paths are not so equitable. And healthcare is a good example. That is actually, healthcare is probably the best career path in terms of taking people who have a very little education and moving them to better types of jobs. Because you can start as a home health aide, for instance, and move into, licensed practical nurse, and then you can move into registered nurse. And a lot of people make these transitions. Of course, you have to get some formal education to do these things, but this was just to point out that these transitions are actually relatively common in the healthcare sector, but they're particularly common for white workers and less common for Black and Hispanic workers. Though they're still much more prevalent in the healthcare sector than in many other sectors, but always within these transition matrices, there's always some of these differences across groups too. So that's what I have. Again, we're the Workforce of the Future, and we have these tools on our website that can, you can look up your location, or you can find a lot more specific information about this stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Greg. We appreciate all the information and information about the tools, the mobility platform tool. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to capture those as we go. You can type those in chat, and chat can be found at the bottom of your screen if you're on a PC. We'll address those questions at the end after everyone has had an opportunity to speak. All of our presenters have had an opportunity to speak, that is. Our next presenter is Carrie Amann. She's the Executive Director for the Pennsylvania Workforce Development Association. Carrie will offer a perspective on workforce development in Pennsylvania. Carrie serves as the Executive Director of PWDA, and prior to joining PWDA, she started her career at local Workforce Development Board, supporting industry partners. She managed administration of the Recovery Act for the Department of Labor and Industry, guided corrections and reentry policy for the Department of Corrections, and oversaw the State Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act program operations. Most recently, she served as the Deputy Secretary for Policy for Governor Wolf, where she led the Education and Workforce Development Policy agenda, including the development and launch of PA Smart to help students and workers prepare for the jobs of today and tomorrow. She holds a bachelor's degree in policy studies from Dickinson College and a master's degree in public administration from Penn State University. Carrie, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, LeeAnne. Just get my screen share here. Everything good there? I think that's going to be like the new, if we have any new normals, it's like, can you hear me? And is everything good?
It looks good,
can you
Carrie.
see my screen?
We can, it looks good.
Good morning, everyone, and I thank you on this crisp, it looks sunny in Harrisburg, central Pennsylvania this morning. So depending upon where you're at, I hope it's as sunny and cool where you're at. As LeeAnne mentioned, I'm Carrie Amann. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Workforce Development Association. And I just want to give some kudos to Rakesh and Greg. As a policy person, I love data, I love charts, I love looking at these type of trends, but I am thankful I am not talking about data. I am the part of the presentation where they have asked us to dive in a little bit more on the policy landscape, and that's big P policy. What are we hearing across the Commonwealth? What are we experiencing across the Commonwealth? And then what's kind of the on-trend discussions going on around workforce and talent development? A little bit about PWDA. We are the professional association for the workforce development industry. And so our members range from workforce boards to career and tech centers to training and education providers, community-based organizations to individual professionals. And so we've been around for over 35 years, and ultimately our members help Pennsylvanians find jobs. We help Pennsylvanians access new skills and the right skills or reskilling. And we support employers, we support job seekers, we support existing workers. But at the end of the day, we really want to strengthen regional economies across Pennsylvania and also help people get out of poverty. And so a little bit about kind of what you all have heard and about what our members have heard across the Commonwealth since really, well, it's not just since COVID, but since COVID, the voices of where are all the workers? Where have they gone? And Greg and Rakesh hopefully provided you some of the background on the data and the trends, that this is not a short-term effect, that Pennsylvania is, while we look at unemployment information, we look at labor force participation a lot in the workforce world, and Pennsylvania is slower than other states across the country in terms of its declining labor force, but we are losing workers. They're dropping out of the workforce, they're retiring quicker, and for a multitude of reasons, our employers are really saying, where are they, where are they, where are they? And so what that's really forcing in the policy world is to sit down and talk with employers and job seekers to get a sense of how do we help, in our world, help make that connection, and then help employers keep and retain the skilled talent. And so Rakesh and Greg talked about the data, and what we like to talk about here a little bit more is that the impacts of the shutdowns really did start to give workers probably an increased agency of choice than what they may have experienced in the past. When you have multiple industries shutting down, you have a public health crisis that really make people think about great reassessments, you might have called it. Workers are really truly assessing what employment means to them and what they want in their employment paths. And so when we think about some of the points that have been talked about around disparate impacts in the workforce, that public service is hard if you're working in public facing occupations and hospitality and healthcare and manufacturing, that workers, while we have decreasing unemployment, there's still job seekers available and searching for work. But I don't think we've ever been in this place of worker agency being as significant in the discussion around job placement, recruitment, and retention. At least we haven't seen it in the Great Recession and at this magnitude. When we think about choices for employers, a lot of the times we hear employers want skilled workers, right? They want workers that show up on time. Soft skill development is always a big issue in the workforce world. And the one question in my experience is we always go to the employers and say, what does that mean? And how does a job seeker or unemployed worker demonstrate that to you, right? And it's not good enough to say, well, they demonstrate that 5 steps into the hiring process. And so when we start to think about what is advantages in the market right now for workers and employers, it really is going a little bit more beyond the wages. It is about what employers are they assessing their hiring processes. That does not mean to water them down, but are they recruiting in ways that align with the demand? And so I know a lot of you all probably talk to employers or are employers, and I do think there is like this little awakening that has to happen in terms of what are we doing to recruit that goes inclusive of a wage, but beyond a wage. And so when I say here we go again, we know that every time, and the data has shown, like when a recession happens and we have high levels of unemployment, we can draw on history. And so when we think about what happened every time unemployment increases, we oftentimes also see this significant increase in federal investment. Most recently, that was the Great Recession with the American Recovery Act. I'm trying not to speak in acronyms because I know about you all that we have our own language. And so if I speak in acronyms and you don't know what that means, just flag that for me in the comments. But we know that history repeating itself, so that funding gets put on the table, and the federal government has discussed things around the American Rescue Plan, which was $7 billion at the state level for Pennsylvania. It's $13 billion in total when you factor in county, state, and non-county investments. But we also know that the Biden administration has been looking at a specific jobs plan that was being built initially in its infrastructure, now being discussed in reconciliation. That's $100 billion investment in workforce development. And in the workforce world, and I'm sure as you all know, if you want to build roads and build infrastructure and recruit businesses, you have to do this both the supply and demand side. If you want to increase the infrastructure and economic development, you have to do that in tandem with the bodies and the skilled workers that can do that work. And with the shortages we're facing, we're really advocating for new investments so that we can look at new ways of supporting workers and getting them connected to jobs. And I know Lucyann after me is going to talk a little bit about practitioners side of the house and kind of what they're facing. So I'm going to stay high level on this. But one thing that I want to highlight, and I want to focus a little bit on Greg's discussion points around mobility and why that matters, is because at the end of the day, we don't want individual Pennsylvanians to just get a job at any job. And we know in Pennsylvania, employers don't just want any worker. Otherwise, they would be hiring people who are looking for jobs at different rates than what they currently are. And they do want someone that's skilled or someone that has the ability to demonstrate that they have the opportunity to increase those skills. And hopefully they can move along those career paths. And so the one thing that we've really tried to talk about in the workforce world is trying to highlight, have we learned anything the last time we went through a recession? We saw high levels of unemployment, but that we have to factor in that career paths might be existing. Are we getting people connected? Are employers demonstrating what those career paths are? And really focusing on what we were talking about on the prior slide around agency, but also that we can't just keep cycling through what I call cookies, right? You just can't keep passing out cookies from the cookie jar and then expecting people are satisfied because we said, look how many cookies we passed out. We really have to start thinking in different ways. And can we start to apply the things that we learned so that we can really enter a post-COVID-19 recovery? A little bit on what's going on in Harrisburg. And so we're just highlighting two facets here. Depending upon who you ask about what's going on in Harrisburg, there is going to be vast differences, but I'm going to try to highlight some of the things from a workforce lens that the administration and the General Assembly are talking about. And I won't go them in detail, but Governor Wolf has really been prioritizing the administration's focus for workforce development on the Keystone Command Center. They happen to push out a report of recommendations around the workforce development system and service delivery across Pennsylvania immediately prior to COVID. And they're still looking at those recommendations to see like what is still relevant today. And they range from everything from reentry to the workforce system, to education, to community-based organizations, to occupational licensure and more. And so we are entering into this 12 plus-ish, 14, 15-ish month session of this administration. And so we'll see, right, if it's a lame duck. Will the governor be able to accomplish some legacy building effects from his prior 7-ish, 8 years? And what will they be able to accomplish between now and the end of 2022? We do know that the governor has been exercising authority in executive orders and regulatory authority. Some of you might have seen some things around most recently his push for economic development funding. If they're going to employers and organizations in Pennsylvania, that they explore quality work conditions such as paid family leave, minimum wage levels above the mandated minimum wage, and more. The question mark for both the governor and the General Assembly is, what are we going to do with that $5 billion investment that they kicked down the line from the budget that they put into reserves, and they did not push that into communities? And so there is going to have to be some discussion with the administration and the General Assembly on how are they spending those $5 billion in reserves that they did not decide what to do with in the budget. And on the General Assembly side, I do want to highlight that at least coming out of the House, they have a Pennsylvania Economic Recovery Task Force that's chaired by Representative Coffer from Lucyann County. That goal is to, quote, kickstart the economy with legislative and policy ideas. And so far, there's just been a lot of committee work discussing and educating and informing the members on what is going on across the Commonwealth. We know that the General Assembly is looking at the temporary COVID waivers, that making them permanent, and pushing legislation in that side. But generally speaking, for the most part, around workforce development, there's been a lot of talking points with little legislative action, little investment going on. And we're hoping that some of that might pick up as they talk about ARP spend. And so I'm trying to be mindful of time. So at the association, what we put together was what we're calling our 10 strategies document. And so we really are looking at some of the proven practices that workforce development across Pennsylvania has been focusing on to serve both the supply and demand, right? We are uniquely positioned that we can't just help employers fill jobs if we also don't help job seekers and workers make sure they're ready and able to find and keep family sustaining employment. And so when we highlight in the report a little bit around what Deputy Secretary Ireland from Labor and Industry calls radical truths, you won't see that language in PA work, but we really have to start thinking about, can we have radical truth conversation around who's the experts in what? Can we both work together? Can workforce development work with economic development, work with education, and more, and all recognizing that we're serving the same communities, we're serving the same consumers. We might be sitting at different tables in the same room or even the same table with different seats, but can we get there? So the real question is, can we look at this and highlighting some of the data points previously provided, can we do this with an equity lens? Can we address the disparate impacts? Do we have the right leadership going on at state and local governments, as well as nonprofit and private sectors? And can we do it innovatively? I don't think there's any such thing as a normal or going back to what we even may call a new normal. We highlight 10 strategies. I'm not going to go over all of them. For those in the attendance, I will highlight a couple of them. But from the policy world, job training alone doesn't cut it. Where we are focused on career mobility. What you see is our 10 strategies really focused around 3 components: the work we do for workforce development, the places in which we work, so the work, the workplaces, and the workforce. And so we really are trying to highlight strategies that lift up and support the work, how we do the work in the workplaces, and then do we have quality skilled professionals in workforce development, and can we provide them the supports they need to effectively do the jobs that they need to do. And streamlining access to workforce development. And I have a little note here is like, what do you view as workforce development? Because I know if I asked each one of you, you may all give me a different definition. And so it's complicated, right? And so our role is what we're really trying to do is uncomplicate it straight from like the perspective and definition of what people think workforce development is, down to the customer, whether that's a job seeker or an employer, so that they can navigate our systems easily, and then tap into education when they need it, and have clarity around the type of demand that employers have for skills and competencies beyond just give me a resume that shows I have a bachelor's degree. And so we are talking in the report that we need better systems and networking discussions. That's why, Greg, I really like your network models and I want to talk to you, because when you start to map and visualize networks, workforce development is a network. We are a system. We're not just programs, and we're intermediaries that connect to services. And a lot of this is happening regionally and locally. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And working for 10 years in state government, I can honestly say the bubble hasn't popped, and I am recognizing the value of regional economies more than I ever have in the past. And so can we define competitive advantages? Not everyone is all can't do everything for everyone. So what are we good at? And can we effectively partner with individuals? A career pathway to every Pennsylvania employer. We're really driven on career pathways, somewhat around the governor's goal around post-secondary attainment. And so employers, a report by Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce, I might get that acronym wrong, CEW, said, Pennsylvania employers report that they need workers. 60% of Pennsylvanians need some type of post-secondary degree by 2025 is the governor's goal. I believe the report might have been by 2020. And so when we think about career pathways and mobility, it's not just let me give them a shadowing experience at that manufacturing company, right? Career pathways are legitimate, designed mobile pathways that move people from occupation to occupation with on-ramps, with off-ramps, and allow people to really move. And ideally in workforce development, they do so that at a family sustaining level. And I think that we do need some clarity on education paths in Pennsylvania. Well, we know K-12 is integrated, and there's a lot of work going on Future Ready Index, on CTE, on Career Ready PA, you name it at the K-12 level. The second a student walks out of a high school, understanding the career paths that apply to them, whether that's to be career ready, right? And how they get there, it's not that clear and it's not that accessible. And so we are advocating that, we really need clarity around current accessible credentials in Pennsylvania that fit what employers say they want. I can't walk into a career link today in Pennsylvania and understand if I want to go from manufacturing into be a carpenter, what are the education and training classes today that I need outside of some of the WIOA models and career pathway models. I need practical information. And so we think that there are new models of engagement. There's new models of learning around work-based learning and registered apprenticeships, and I threw acronyms in there for you. And then also hiring. And so what are we doing around hiring? And then supporting Pennsylvanians back to work. From the landscape of this, it's more than just job training. A lot of people define workforce development as job training, and the professionals in this world know it's more than that, and that quality matters. And so when we think about disparate impacts, when we think about what it takes for someone to get and keep a job, it's not as easy as saying get them to the bottom rung of the ladder and then they can climb up. Those rungs are broken. And so how do we get them the supports and the structure they need around transportation, flexibility? What does remote work look like? Things are that, everything else but the wage that really doesn't get talked about. And I can't stress enough the skills-focused approaches. We talk about credential attainment. We talk about what employers need on resumes, but how do I, as a job seeker or a worker, demonstrate the skills I have in a way that employers will acknowledge it at the very beginning of my job search or my application to be promoted. And I'm just going to touch really briefly, strengthen industry partnerships. Industry partnerships is a model in Pennsylvania where we bring together employers from the same industry sectors to talk about their common talent needs. And ultimately, yes, we get competing manufacturing companies and logistics and supply and healthcare companies. And I would encourage you all, if you're not already, to get connected to your industry partnership through your local workforce board. And if they're not running it, they can point you in the right direction. This is where employers sit around the table and focus on being demand driven. And then it's more than just education and economic development and workforce development, telling the employers, here's my book of programs that are available to you. It's really sitting down and talking to them in ways that address their problems rather than our catalog of services. And ultimately, the goal is to try to get the employers to keep and maintain and strengthen their economic competitiveness. And so we have industry partnerships across the Commonwealth, and we know that they work. So when employers invest and engage in their talent needs, they get what they want. And then last but not least, and this is like the policy nerd in me coming out, oops. That slide is wrong. Free the data ultimately means we know at the end of the day, we have bureaucracy of different data sets that are coming in at the state level that you all as local practitioners or local economic development planners or education partners get asked very common sense questions and we can't answer them. Or at the end of the day, it's something as simple as saying we can answer that question, but the data is not going to be available for 9, 10, 12, 14, 15 months. And so how do we get better data to better improve our services so that we can help employers and job seekers and workers in the ways that we need to help them. And for us, we know there's a lot of publicly accessible data. We know that as state agencies and public entities, we have access to data sets, but the state agencies push that data collection down on the local service systems. And it wastes time and resources and money that we just can't afford. And so when we talk about free the data, it really is, there's publicly accessible data that will help individual workforce development, education, and economic developers do their jobs better. And we just want to, quote, free that data set so that it's more free flowing and accessible. And so at the end of the day, like, workforce development is a part of economic development, right? And so we think that sitting at this intersection between the talent and the employment, we do have a role at the table. And ideally, when we start talking more economic development, so I'm really grateful to the Economy League and Mantech for having us here, that we do start to think about ways that these systems integrate and how do professionals really integrate with the radical truth that we all are serving the same customers, and the employers are getting fatigued by each of us telling them we can all solve their problems. And so how do we really, truly effectively work together? And I believe we can. And so I do want to shout out, because I noticed the Pennsylvania Economy League is from Wilkes-Barre. I'm a Wilkes-Barre, well, they're located in Wilkes-Barre. I'm a Northeast Pennsylvanian. I grew up in the Heights. I went to GAR High School, and I just wanted to say thanks to the Economy League and Mantech and others for sitting on the panel today. GAR is one of the few Grand Army of the Republic, and I know Wilkes-Barre's been going through a lot with school consolidation buildings and such, but just shout out to my hometown of Wilkes-Barre. So that's all I have. So, LeeAnne.
Thanks, Carrie. I was wondering where that picture of the high school came into play.
Yeah,
yeah, we do have locations in Wilkes-Barre and Harrisburg, and then we have sister organizations in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So we've got the whole state covered essentially. Thank you, Carrie. Our final speaker today is Lucyann Vierling. She's the Executive Director for the Wayne Pike Workforce Alliance. She will offer a local and rural perspective addressing the people side of economic development. I think a great segue from Carrie's presentation. Lucyann has 30 years of experience in workforce development and extensive experience with federal, state, and local funding administration, program design and development, and implementation. She's served in a variety of capacities over her career, from case manager to career advisor, economic planner, and executive director of a regional workforce board. She currently is leading one of 9 Department of Education designated community education councils in Pennsylvania as an appointed member of the Governor's Advisory Council on Rural Affairs. She's a true believer in lifelong learning and approaches workforce development as a main component in an economic ecosystem, and focuses on the interrelationships within the scope of work of the organization she directs. As an adult learner, she obtained her bachelor's degree in business administration and master's degree in organizational management from Misericordia University. I'll turn it over to you, Lucyann.
Okay, all right. I'm the last batter here. So thank you, and I appreciate everyone's time and attention today. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Yay, I did it correctly. So again, you take it from Pew, Brookings, State Association, Lucyann. So again, I appreciate the time and attention here today. Anything I comment on is Lucyann's opinion only. I was once called a positive disruptor, and I truly enjoy that title because I've lived workforce for the last 30 some years. And when you start out as a poor kid in a summer youth program for us in the workforce development field, it becomes a passion and a truly pay it forward occupation and career path.
Economic development and education and workforce should work together. We do, and it's real. It's such a joy to have the inclusion, which brings in community-based partners. It brings in government, it brings in housing, mental health. It brings in all aspects of what a vibrant community is and works towards that greater goal. So, when we say we need to change that paradigm, The American Job Center is only one component of workforce.
I share that because one, I just dig my picture, but two is we truly are working as a collaborative in Wayne County. And I want to share some models with you on what is a workforce development system.
Economic development and education and work.
There we go. So a little bit about, I'm going to take you on a high level tour of creating a workforce development system and then what the iteration is today. So out of an economic development plan, in generating a business park, they were astute at that point in time to recognize we've got to focus on people. And that is back in the time that we knew what was ahead of us. So if we talk about what is the issue of this forum, the issue is that we have not had a collective look or action over the last decades of what we knew was coming. And that's generational cohorts and the aging of our population and not enough bodies to fill it. So back at that point in time, we started generating an organization that developed a collective look at what are people in the labor market. Are they K to 12? Are they post high school? Are they adults in our community? We are totally rural. Again, economic challenges, educational challenges. And as we state here, we are an educational desert. So building the system, I won't go through. I will just highlight that in 2012, we became a community education council. And if you are not aware, I will enlighten you on what they are in the Commonwealth. But as you see, we continue to develop this system, bringing in resources that filled gaps, not just bringing in resources to bring in resources, but working collectively to fill gaps. My shout out, if you did not know or are not aware of community education councils in the Commonwealth, we are designated by the Department of Education. We are in the public school code. And essentially, our role is to create educational opportunities in rural, educationally underserved communities. We are a line item in the Commonwealth budget under Department of Education, and each of our community education councils adapt to their community. So we do things a little differently. Ours in Wayne and Pike moves towards a system of workforce that was started prior to that designation. So again, how do we work in PA Career Links? That is that part of the American Job Center. That's not the center of the universe. That's a part of the system. The people, the businesses, the individuals within our community, they are the center of the universe. And how do we collectively work together with the various stakeholders to build that pathway to prosperity? The next iteration, as we have this founded model that is working, that model is now replicated in a county-wide, total community-based ecosystem. This is called Wayne Tomorrow. And I'm just so proud of Wayne County for moving its community forward by bringing in a collective approach on how we work together. And again, we don't work together well all the time, but this partnership is the forum to agree, to disagree, and to work through common goals in a willingness to move the community forward. It is a non-entity, which is the beauty. It's bringing together individuals who want to work in a team-oriented environment. County Comprehensive Plan, that's where this all started. Pretty similar to economic development 15 years prior, saying, you know, if we're doing this, we need this. The county looked at their plan and said, why write a plan if it's going to sit on a shelf? And that's where this whole kind of formalized collective thinking started. So this is kind of how we float. And this has taken time and action. And anytime, you know, you are moving boulders up a hill, if you will, it does take time, but it takes partners who believe in what they are doing. So we kind of work through task force. And here are some, looking at the different sectors of our community. So if we say, well, what does this have to do with workforce? Everything. Transportation impacts people. Housing availability impacts people. I'm looking here, I pulled from the other perspectives of the sectors of job loss. But what is our anchor? Our hospital, community, health, wellness. Agriculture, some might say, well, that's really not a sector of prominence in the Commonwealth. Well, it is to us. And when we look at the last 4 decades and the reduction of over 1,000 dairy farms to 40, but we look at our highest agricultural commodity, which is milk, we need to focus on that sector. And I wish I had time to go through all the action items and opportunities and successes we've had in these different perspectives. But again, it's that collective look of what impacts people. So again, we have task force, we have professionals from the different aspects of our community. Childcare is another bubble. And I know someone else had a question with regard to childcare. Huge, absolutely huge impact. Pre-pandemic, current, because we're not post-pandemic, and then the post-pandemic. So similar to as Carrie was talking about, we're working with, we have 41 units of childcare in Wayne and Pike counties. So how do we assist them? Through registered apprenticeships, working on developing talent. But therefore, we also have to work on how do we increase occupational wages for that most important job in our community, which is taking care of our children. So again, as any other collective group, you have challenges, but again, it's getting back to working through those challenges together. Money, yeah, okay, sure. But it's also resources with regard to ideas, thoughts, influences, sustainability. Big issue with regard to any aspect of a community. Education, community-based amenities, having the appropriate infrastructure, which right here, broadband is a huge one in rural communities. And that, if we talk about what has COVID opened our eyes to, we have children who did not have internet. We have areas of our county that do not have accessibility. And our learning model went to a remote. And when previous presenters talked about remote occupations, challenge. So again, how do we focus on those challenges in a collective manner? Because they are all interrelated. So again, just some high level, where are we now? We've got a system, but what we have more so is we have that collective truth that Carrie had mentioned. We are working together as a system. We are looking at resources and working to say, this would better be sought by you, foundation, or you, government, or how do we partner to get to that end goal, Chamber of Commerce. We're not looking at the I, we're looking at the we. And this is real. So if a grant comes in or a federal opportunity, we're on the phone. Hey, how do we work this? How do we work within our partnership to make additional external resources happen? What was talked about earlier with regard to ARP, or the American Rescue Plan. Do you know we have a group sitting down and we're looking at schools, you received funds, hospital, you received funds, municipalities, you received funds, county government. We're all in the room saying, okay, what are you doing? How do we leverage our resources? We don't want to duplicate. We want to align. We want to build upon the resources for the betterment of the community. And I'd be happy to know if there are any other communities that are actually doing that, opening up the playbook and saying, this is how we're looking to plan the usage of these resources that have come in. So let's talk about threats and or opportunities. So back, I had told you, we're an educational desert, right? So how are we building educational programs? How are we doing distance learning if we don't have the bandwidth? These are additional challenges. Initially, as was mentioned, the 4 sectors of job loss, we got them, okay? So we're in the Northern Poconos. What do you think of? Hospitality, leisure, retail, hit tremendously hard, has had an issue with regard to rebounding. But again, is that a threat or an opportunity? Lack of broadband, as we had talked about. How does that impact immigration? In Wayne County, between 2008 and 2020, we have lost 3,600 individuals in our labor force participation. Why? Well, the deeper dive. We know we have a 2-to-1 death to birth rate. Again, these are things that have been trending, and we haven't taken that deep dive look over time. So if there is a positive in this COVID situation, it's bringing those demographic data to life. It's bringing the opportunity to do something about it collectively. Housing was brought up. All properties, we're within 2 hours of major metro, New York City, Philly. Houses are being, there is none. So what does that do for immigration? Do we have applicable housing for individuals who are in poverty or the working poor? 85% of our businesses, small, right? Under 10, 65, under 5. What does that say? Is that an opportunity to embed more entrepreneurial activities? We did. We have a community-based incubator. We worked with the Commonwealth to manipulate the footprint of a KIZ zone, or Keystone Innovation Zone, because we don't have higher education presence with regard to research. So we're pushing through these things, looking at these challenges we have above us. Again, individual per capita. Well, does that equate over to the industry profile? So our goal is to, how do we balance that industry profile, excuse me? How do we work with our K-12 system? And again, we go back to, I have a peeve about looking at occupations in demand. I'd rather look in, what are the innate skills and abilities needed by an individual? Can they think independently? Are they technology savvy? Do they have financial literacy? Those are things that you can teach a skill, but you can't teach personality. And I'm very fortunate in our school districts. They've done very well with regard to their K-12 and career pathways or comprehensive career development systems. And that comes from a community-based approach. How do you get businesses to talk about? Well, you have intermediaries, you have manipulators who can work to say, kids need to understand what's in their community first. But then we as a community need to ensure we meet their expectations to stay. So again, just looking back at some of the things, I think if there's anything, and you always have to look at the glass half full, right? This has been a period of reevaluation. It's been a period of choice, and it's been a period of change. So we conduct our workforce development activities as a method of being transformational, not transactional. We have over 1 million people in the Commonwealth with some college, but no degree or industry recognized something. Do you know what it's like to go into a 55-year-old and saying, hey, gee, you think about taking an AutoCAD class? It's a little more than that. So again, I do a shout out to my team in Wayne County, because you've got to talk through, you need to coach through. It's very easy to say, well, let's transfer, let's be mobile, unless the individual understands the necessity, but also has that drive to make change in their life. The data, I'm going to give a shout out locally. I'm a part of what's called the Institute for Public Policy and Economic Development, which is a research think tank. And we talk about data. We work with our communities. We work with our higher ed, because data's got to drive the decision making, but do it in a manner that is inclusive of all. I talk about being the cotton candy machine, right? If you have a good idea and you have partners that believe, you just keep churning and churning. And what happens? More people get involved. More people see the outcomes in a positive manner, and more people want to be doing better for their community and for the Commonwealth as a whole. Just looking through my notes, I think I touched on everything I wanted to talk about today. not enough time. As you can tell, I am nuts over what we're doing because I believe we're doing it differently. There's a change coming, and I'm glad. Anytime we talk about policy and how it impacts reality, it's like walking in peanut butter. And that's no different from any system, the educational system, governmental system, localized systems, right? But we have to start pushing to make change. So again, I just, rural does rock. When you have limited resources, sometimes you can do so much more together. So thank you for your time. Yeah, stop waiting for the change and start leading it in your community. And again, I appreciate everyone's presentations today. And let's make some noise. Let's have some action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucyann, and thank you to all of our panelists for the really thoughtful discussion and points that you've brought up. I mean, there are just so many interconnected issues related to and impacting workforce. We've touched on so many of them today. We could go on for another hour talking about some of these issues, but I recognize folks' times are limited this morning. You know, COVID has perhaps accelerated or maybe highlighted the need for collaboration on some of these issues. And it's really great to hear what is happening, Lucyann, in your community, as well as Carrie, you know, in the state overall. A couple of questions that have come in that are asking related to demographics on both sides of the equation, really. Looking at the demographic shift, Lucyann, that you touched on in terms of losing workforce due to folks deciding to retire, or just the simple aging of our population in the state as a whole. And what is the impact of that aging population on employers finding and keeping qualified employees, and the state's ability as a whole to attract business? I'll throw that out to really any of our panelists to respond to.
It's a huge issue. As stated, we have the highest median age in the Commonwealth by county data. When I look at our current unemployment, 51% of individuals on continued unemployment are over the age of 45. 38% are over the age of 55.
Yeah.
So again, our individuals, I can't guess what's in individuals' heads. Yeah. Is it time to suck it up and slide into 62? Is it time to take pause and say, I do have the means to get out of what I'm doing and perhaps start my own business? But also we're working with our businesses to say, look at what you're offering. Is there an opportunity for split shifts? Is there an opportunity for shorter shifts in a more, part-time manner? We're losing so much institutional knowledge in these individuals. We have to think of ways to re-engage. So it's an issue we are looking at very seriously, but it takes both sides of the perspective.
Yeah, and I think to add on to what Lucyann said, like, we are addressing an older worker population and their needs are different, right? But most of the times employers' recruiting processes are one size fits all regardless of your age. And we're also now starting to hear stories where we have older workers over the age of 55 who are ranging from blue collar to white collar, if you so to speak, who are looking for new jobs and employers are not hiring them. Like, we're getting examples of someone that's 52, I think maybe 53, who applied to like 30 job openings, very qualified white collar professional, and is not getting hired. And so I think when we start thinking about what do you do for older workers, it's the same question around what are we doing just for all of our workers, around diversity of what they need, around diversity of the demographics. And we're not going to grow our way out. We're not growing our way out of this. And immigration and in-migration into Pennsylvania, recruitment's a big deal. And so it's twofold. It's like, how do we help the workforce get connected to the employers that we have currently? And then how do we also recruit, because our birth rates are just not there. Right. And so we do not have enough high school students in Pennsylvania to meet the job vacancy needs of employers. And so we need to expand beyond just K-12 strategies. And what does lifelong learning look like? Are our systems built to serve adults? right? If you call up your education institution or training institution, are they equally able to serve that 45-year-old that has a family, a parent that they're taking care of, and can't do your traditional credit hour-based structure? So there's a lot of questions here, and it's multifaceted, but there's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Lucyann. That is the other side of the equation. We had a couple questions related to high school level education. How can high school level education better connect students to careers that don't require a college degree, such as construction that Greg talked about?
I mean, I know Lucyann could probably highlight being the education council, but I would say get connected with current tech ed. Get connected with like organizations like Lucyann. We have business education partnerships across the Commonwealth who do this type of connection with K-12. I mean, there's a funding proposal out right now from L&I. Lucyann and I have talked about these things. I understand this, but like those maps are there. It's really trying to navigate who is part of that network. And so getting in touch with, I mean, I would just say your career tech ed, your local workforce board, or a community education council like Lucyann.
Yeah, I would also say, and again, understanding skills and pathways, anything post-secondary, in my opinion, is college. Okay. So first of all, we've got to get out of non-college. It's something post-secondary. You know, people say, oh, tech ed is for people who want to work with their hands. Well, for the grace of God, I hope my surgeon went to tech, right? So again, if they're, let me know who you are. You know, I'll help you dog down someone in your community. Chambers of commerce, right? You know, getting to understand what's in your community. But again, I take it back because there's two sides to every coin. In high school, we want our children to gravitate to the academics that they have passion in, right? My daughter's a math nerd. Well, where can you take math as a career? And those are some of the things by bringing in outside businesses to talk about construction, that's all math. So again, you're looking at taking the academic to the occupation, but better focusing on the skill set. So again, I don't know where you are in the Commonwealth, but there's partners in your community that hopefully you're tapped into. If not, we got to make sure they are.
LeeAnne, I have a question. I didn't send it in writing, but may I ask my question?
Go ahead, Bernie.
Yeah, I'm Bernie Banks, American Asphalt Paving. I'm in Luzerne County. I'm in the civil construction business, and we manufacture aggregate and asphalt products, and we haul our own products. I've got about 150 employees. We do in-house training of our quarry people and construction tasks, and we'll train our own CDL drivers if we can find them. Our biggest problem is hiring willing workers. The biggest competition I see is in attracting new workers are the state and federal programs that pay people not to work. People look at what they can earn to sit home and maybe work on the side, and they choose not to put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week. Margaret Thatcher years ago, when she took office, the unemployment rate was 17% in the United Kingdom. And her solution was she just stopped welfare and everybody went back to work. Externally, increasing government regulations and bureaucracy are a problem, but also externally, our public school systems seem to push students who can't read and write through the system to graduate. They don't educate them properly. I see too many people applying for jobs who can't read and write up to standard. I think that all of these job shortages cause inflation. Right now, we're having to raise rates for no reason other than try to attract more workers. I think what these government agencies need to really focus on is to analyze the relationship between unemployment and government handouts, both on the federal and state level. I think there's a totally direct relationship. And
Right, can you talk about that?
Bernie,
Yeah.
thanks for your question. Let's let the panelists weigh in on this. I'm sure Greg and Carrie have some comments here. Thank you, Bernie.
I just have one second analysis that I think they should focus on, and that's the relationship of unemployment and poverty with regard to the education, the ability for people to read and write that are pushed through schools.
Yeah, and I mean, there are definitely a lot of challenges associated with the education system and whether or not we're training people. You know, I think a lot of these jobs, like the construction jobs that you're trying to hire people for, require at least, 10th grade, reading and writing skills. And a lot of people are graduating from high school without that level of skill. And that's a pretty deep problem. I was going to just comment briefly on this question of whether or not people are, staying out of the labor market because of the unemployment insurance, the extended benefits, and the stimulus package. And one kind of interesting and from a researcher's perspective, very nice thing is that a lot of the states ended their unemployment insurance earlier than other states and at different times. And so people have looked at this very recently. It's actually been a big topic in the research community, which is what is the impact of the unemployment insurance extension and bonuses and funding on people's willingness to go back to work. And what people find is actually it's pretty small. So people don't actually seem to be very much staying out of the labor force because they have these extended benefits. But though they do find some small effects, and some of that, it seems like a lot of these other things are probably keeping people out of the labor force right now, which is like childcare issues, a little bit of concern about the continuing pandemic, and some other things.
Yeah, and to address your education, like if I told you that there are 376,000 individuals in Pennsylvania with a CDL, like we don't have a credentialing problem. Like there's plenty of people in Pennsylvania that have a CDL to fill the vacancies that employers need. I really do think like what you're talking about, and which I've experienced talking with employers, my background in workforce development is industry partnerships. It's talking to employers more than like serving on the front line. And is that it's really important that building those partnerships with education systems, building those partnerships with organizations who tap into the talent you need. You're not going to get it through just a job posting that says, here's my requirements, because you don't hire that way. And so like talking to education about, okay, I don't know where you're at, and where are you at, Bernie, in Lucerne?
I'm in Wilkes-Barre and
okay, so like go talk to your career tech center, right, and say, okay, go Wilkes-Barre CTC, how do I better communicate my needs of an employer to you so I can better understand students are demonstrating. I think employers really have to understand, how does a job seeker demonstrate they have what you need? That's not just a high school diploma, because you don't hire that way. And so I think if you can talk a little bit more about, these are the skills I need, this is how I recognize a job seeker has them, that will be beneficial. I think if employers don't engage with their education and training systems, how would we ever expect a supply side system to ever meet demand if the demand doesn't clarify what they want?
Thank you very much, Carrie. We are past our time, actually. This time went fast here this morning. Lots of good information. I appreciate all the panelists participating today, and thank you for those who are in attendance. We will continue this conversation through our e-alerts, and we'll certainly be continuing it in our regional economic areas across the state. And we appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much, and have a great day.